Attenzione che inizia la registrazione, il recording starts now, and in 1 minute we lock the microphones, not the video but the microphones.
Posso? Ditemi, fatemi un cenno.
Ok.
Allora, buongiorno a tutti e grazie davvero a tutti per essere qui. Questo è il terzo e l'ultimo incontro del ciclo La Mitteleuropa ebraica, che è organizzato dall'Associazione di Studi Ebraico-Tedeschi e dal laboratorio sulla Mitteleuropa presso il Centro di Alti Studi Umanistici dell'Università di Trento. Siamo molto contenti e molto onorati di ospitare qui oggi Marc Volovici, che è l'autore di una monografia recente che si chiama German as a Jewish Problem, The Language Politics of Jewish Nationalism, Stanford University Press 2020, e di questo libro parleremo oggi. E io lo ringrazio intanto davvero molto per aver accettato l'invito. Allora, prima di entrare nel vivo della questione, io vorrei dire, intanto presentare l'ospite di oggi, poi dire proprio due cose dal canto mio su questo libro. Allora, Marc Volovici ha un solidissimo curriculum di studi ebraici che è lastricato di pubblicazioni, di borse di studio, di ricerca, postdoc, di transiti, di soggiorni presso università prestigiose. Allora, Marc Volovici si forma all'Università Ebraica di Gerusalemme, poi a Friburgo e poi a Princeton, dove consegue il dottorato di ricerca con una tesi dal titolo German and the Language Politics of Jewish Nationalism, dal 1870 al 1939, che poi è il terreno da cui prende le mosse il libro di cui parleremo oggi. Attualmente Marc Volovici lavora presso il Department of History, Classics and Archaeology dell'Università di Londra e precedentemente ha lavorato presso l'Istituto per lo Studio sull'Antisemitismo della stessa università. I suoi campi di studio sono la storia dell'Europa moderna e contemporanea, la storia ebraica moderna e contemporanea, la storia culturale e la storia delle idee. Ha al suo attivo numerosi capitoli di libro, contributi in miscellanea, articoli su rivista che trattano la storia del sionismo e in generale del pensiero nazionale ebraico, poi la storia dell'antisemitismo, del nazionalsocialismo, dell'islamofobia e ancora la resistenza ebraica durante il dodicennio bruno. Marc Volovici è stato anche consulente e supervisore accademico della mostra Jews, Money, Myths, organizzata in collaborazione con il Jewish Museum di Londra nel 2019, e di questa mostra ha co-curato il catalogo. Dunque, Marc oggi parlerà con noi del suo libro recente che ho già nominato, ma di cui ripeto volentieri il titolo, German as a Jewish Problem, The Language Politics of Jewish Nationalism. Si tratta, a mio parere, di un volume molto intelligente che discute il ruolo, che discute il significato, che è un significato insieme concreto e simbolico, rivestito dal tedesco per gli ebrei d'Europa, che abbracciano questa lingua, percependola, se non in alcuni contesti, se non proprio addirittura come una lingua ebraica, ma perlomeno come una lingua talmente pervasiva nella dimensione culturale, politica, religiosa dell'ebraismo, da sfumare la differenza tra lingue ebraiche e lingue non ebraiche, che è una differenza invalsa negli studi sull'interlinguismo, sul multilinguismo ebraico. Si pensi solo a Weinreich, per fare un nome su tanti, no? Ecco, questi studi hanno sempre distinto tra lingue ebraiche, quindi lingue interne alla società ebraica, che possiedono una componente ebraica o aramaica, come per esempio lo Yiddish, e lingue non ebraiche, quindi esterne alla società ebraica e invece associate alle culture maggioritarie all'interno delle quali le comunità ebraiche vivono. Solo la nomina di Hitler a cancelliere del Reich e poi la sua politica discriminatoria, segregazionista, il trauma dell'Olocausto, solo questo, sostiene Volovici, mette la parola fine alla relazione strettissima tra gli ebrei e la lingua tedesca, una relazione che era stata abbastanza indiscussa per 6 generazioni. Allora, Marc Volovici descrive il tedesco come a language across borders, come una lingua che va al di là dei confini, quindi che va al di là dei confini dello Stato nazionale tedesco a partire dal 1871, che coinvolge naturalmente anche tutte le terre della doppia corona asburgica e poi austro-ungarica, e che circola, che è lingua veicolare non solo nel contesto dell'emancipazione ebraica, dell'integrazione, della riforma del culto, ma anche in tutto lo spettro del nazionalismo ebraico. Ecco, questa esplorazione che Volovici, che Marc compie, e questa indagine del ruolo cruciale del tedesco nelle società ebraiche in epoca d'Europa, in epoca moderna e contemporanea, si potrebbe definire, e l'autore lo fa, una storia ebraica della lingua tedesca, quindi A Jewish History of German. Volevo anche ricordare una dimensione forse più biografica, più personale, ossia che Marc è figlio di Leon Volovici, che a sua volta è stato un eminente studioso di antisemitismo e di Shoah, soprattutto in riferimento alla Romania, e i suoi studi sono stati per molti versi pionieristici, quindi l'interesse di Marc si muove anche in una linea così di continuità intellettuale e generazionale. Magari poi lui potrà anche dirci quanto anche della sua storia familiare ha influito sui suoi studi. Allora adesso io lascio naturalmente parlare l'autore, a cui porrò alcune domande in lingua inglese, per lasciare poi spazio magari negli ultimi 10 minuti alle vostre domande. Voi appunto potete formulare le domande come di consueto in chat, oppure se sono particolarmente articolate chiedere la parola ai nostri esperti di Zoom, vi accenderanno il microfono. So, Marc, what you explain in your book is that far beyond the borders of Jewish emancipation, what distinguishes German from other languages spoken by the Jews is the fact that it played a crucial and extremely important role in the transformation of Jewish society from a social, linguistic, and ideologic point of view, and beyond German-speaking lands. You argue that it is impossible to understand the histories of modern Hebrew and Yiddish without situating them in relation to German. Your account starts with the Haskalah, the role of Moses Mendelssohn within it, the urge to replace the Yiddish vernacular with the study of biblical Hebrew, and the use of German as a sort of prerequisite for emancipation. But your account relates not only to the path of the German Jews toward emancipation in the 18th and in the 19th century, but also to the sphere of Zionism and Jewish nationalism at large. With reference to this, I would like to start with a quotation from your book, which underlines the intimacy of Jews, not only German Jews, with the German language within the realm of Jewish nationalism. And I quote, "The Jewish history of the German language reveals a multitude of ways in which German was more than a language. In different periods and contexts, Jewish nationalists learned and unlearned it, idealized it and fought against it, used it and boycotted it. German was thus a Jewish problem, but the nature of that problem was subject to dispute, reflecting the key dilemmas and divisions of Jewish nationalism." Now I leave the word to you, Marc, so that you can comment on this quotation and present the contents of your book, shedding light on this inextricable link between Jews and the German language. Please.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Massimiliano, for engaging with this book and for inviting me here, and also to Laura and Roberta for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here or there or somewhere, and I'm honored to see so many people showing up despite the competition from the Euro 2020, but we can talk about it later. So as for your question, I'll just, I mean, for those who probably haven't read it, I'll just say a few words on what on why I think that the German language deserves a Jewish history of its own, and sort of situate it in the context of the work that I've done. So if there is a Jewish history of the German language, it starts arguably with the Enlightenment and the late 18th century, when processes of emancipation in Central Europe, in Germany and the Habsburg Empire, offered or encouraged, or in some ways even forced Jews to abandon Yiddish, at least gradually, and to adopt the German language, Hochdeutsch, as a first step in a process of integration, partial or complete, in the cultural and economic and political sphere in many German-speaking lands. But at the same time, it was also encouraged by some strands of the Jewish Enlightenment, of the Haskalah in Germany, as you mentioned, Mendelssohn and a few others, who also believed that the German language has the capacity, once Jews adopt it, to transform Jews, to make them better individuals, better subjects of their land where they live, to improve the relations between Jews and non-Jews, and basically to advance the status of Jews, both morally and socially. And there was a promise embedded in the German language as a language of emancipation, of modernization, and because German occupied such an important role in an ideology of emancipation, in an ideology of social betterment, German was not just a practical tool to advance some specific social goals, but it had a particular ideological significance, some kind of a moral value of its own, its place in the world, that fact that German was also a language of literature and of culture, could also mean that the Jews could use it in order to advance their own selves, and also to make Judaism something better, something different, and something that is more suitable to the periods and to the place where they lived. This is a story that has been told before, and I'm not trying to argue for any novelty here, but an element that is not always recognized or not always emphasized is that the resonance of this ideology of improvement through German was not important only in the context of those who lived within German-speaking lands or in German principalities, but it also resonated elsewhere into Eastern Europe, and later also into the US, and even in some non-Ashkenazi parts of the Jewish diaspora. This very idea that German was a pathway to modernity, to put it a bit bluntly, that German has a way of advancing Jewish life. This resonated even in areas where there was no expectation to actually speak German, or to actually prove one's Germanness, as it was the case in Central Europe. So the early ideologies of the Enlightenment in Eastern Europe also put a lot of emphasis on the value of learning German, even passively, of acquainting oneself with German, of reading German, precisely because German was also more accessible than other non-Jewish languages for the masses of Yiddish speakers. I mean, the distance from Yiddish to German was far less dramatic than other European or respectable language that also could potentially transform Jewish life. And it was in this capacity that German was a language that had been perceived as a language that can transform Jewish lives, that can change the outlook of Jewish communities, that can introduce ideas of progress, even of liberalism, that it could be a language that secularizes, or at least that challenges the centrality of traditional ways of thinking in Jewish communities, and obviously as a language of religious reform. And again, the fact that the religious reform movement within Judaism was ultimately born in German-speaking lands also strengthened this link between German and Jewish let's say, social change in Jewish religious life, in Jewish social practices. And it is these different functions of German as a language of secularization and of religious reform made it turn it into a marker of social change. Some would see it as a social change that is positive, as a transformation of breaking the walls of the ghetto, you know, figuratively speaking. But you know, from the other point of view, especially for Orthodox Jews, it also meant a language that has the capacity to withdraw Jews from Judaism, ultimately, of weakening their tie to tradition, to religious observance. And in this sense, German always had this very ambivalent place in Jewish political culture in the 19th century, as a language that is very much inside the Jewish inside Jewish multilingualism and the social fabric, but also a threat to the sort of the solidity. So it is these set of legacies that are always in competition with each other that ultimately remained part of Jewish political culture even into the late 19th century and the 20th century, when Jewish nationalism started to define itself through and against other languages and other ideas of nationhood in the area. But we can talk about this aspect a bit later. So this is sort of the setting of the book.
Thank you, Mark. I would like to try to elaborate on some aspects of your monograph. You rightly state that German was not only spoken by Jews in Germany, but also within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And said as I do, this might seem obvious, but you rightly emphasize the role of German as a lingua franca for Jews in the vast territories of Austria-Hungary in Central and Eastern Europe. Eastern European Jews encountered the German language as students or as immigrants in Berlin and Vienna, and they also spoke it in some German-speaking enclaves in Latvia, for example, or they used it as a language of reading, as language of culture, to keep abreast of European political thought and various cultural orientations. So Jewish intellectuals, such as the proto-Zionist Leon Pinsker, to whom you devote the second beautiful chapter of your book, as well as Mendele Moicher-Skorim, Nahum Sokolov, Achadam, and even Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of modern Hebrew, all of them made concrete use of German. Could you dwell on this aspect and on the historical linguistic context of the double monarchy?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good and very complex question. Precisely this context of the other multilingualisms within which the Jewish multilingualism sort of was part of. So here I think I would maybe emphasize two additional functions of German that I didn't mention in the first question, but that could be expanded on here. So one is really the German in the 19th century, definitely since the mid-19th century onwards, was above all a language of knowledge. I mean, anyone who wanted to acquaint themselves with the most recent scientific discoveries, philosophical, theological, German was the first language to go. I mean, of course, French was crucial as well, and English was also, you know, a universal language in some ways. But the German universities and German-speaking universities and journals and the entire academic atmosphere around the world oriented itself to whatever was happening in the German debates. And this was an important aspect because for Eastern European Jews, what was perceived, at least for members of the Haskalah, as the greatest threat to the existence of Jews in a very quickly changing world, is that Jews do not have access to knowledge. They are sort of stuck within the linguistic realm of Hebrew and Yiddish that offer them some glimpses of knowledge, but not necessarily connect them with the brutal and often exciting transformations that are happening in revolutions and in scientific discoveries and in industrialization in Western Europe. And it was for this reason that Jews had to connect, so to speak, with a vehicle that would bring them into the realm of universal knowledge, into medicine and again philosophy and theology and culture and science. So this was another reason why German had a particularly important but also threatening function in the Jewish linguistic sphere. And at the same time, and especially for those living in Austria, in the Habsburg Empire, or in the Austro-Hungary after 67, German was also the language of empire, and that was a very delicate matter, and it became even more delicate as years went by. That's because, again, already since the 18th century, when the empire advanced a series of social reforms that were meant to basically change the way Jews live and interact and to change and to drift them away from the economic positions within which they were confined until then. So again, so the encouragement of acquiring German and basically forbidding Jews in the empire from using Hebrew and Yiddish for commercial matters. I mean, they were allowed to use them for their own private or religious purposes, but not as part of their everyday encounter with society at large. So German was its association with the empire was so strong that that the identification of Jews with the German languages and with the emancipatory potential that it had remained an important part of how so many Jews in the empire felt and related to it. And there is a very interesting range of sources, both from Austria and Bohemia and Moravia and from Bukovina, of Jews whose identification with German is not just as a language that is, practical or useful, but as a language that signifies the certain protection that the empire offers to Jews as Jews, that it allows a certain existence of Jews as a minority. And in some ways, it also protects them from the other from other national movements living in their midst or other languages. So there was no necessary animosity with other languages of the empire, such as Hungarian or Czech or Polish or any other language. But definitely German had a more respectable or a revered status in Jewish political life. And again, relating to what we spoke about earlier, also a language of religious ritual. So for instance, Hugo Bergman, the Czech Jewish philosopher, called German a half-holy language for Jews of the empire, precisely because it was not a language that was just another language, but rather it was indeed the language that Jews used on Shabbat, and they could speak Czech or other language on every day, but German was the language that was used, in sermons or in prayers, and the language that reflected one's Jewishness, but also one's place in the empire in the most profound sense. And when the empire disintegrated, and we can talk about it again maybe a bit later, this sort of linguistic loyalty was under threat, and also enhanced the suspicion of other national groups in the empire or in succeeding countries towards Jews and towards their affinities. In the context of Hebrew, or at least of those proponents of Hebrew culture and Hebrew language, these ideas that German had a profound role in Jewish life as a language of knowledge and a language of empire also had an important consequence insofar as Hebrew itself, despite the ideology that tried to valorize it and to emphasize its importance for Jewish national revival, was not in a position to actually serve as a modern language, at least not yet. It did not have the lexicographical depth, it did not have the prestige, and not the population of readers that could actually use it as a modern language, as a scientific language. And this is why, alongside this sort of constant attempt to advance the status of Hebrew, the reliance on German even in Palestine or in the Jewish literary and political spheres, the reliance on German remained a very critical feature of Jewish multilingualism well into the 20th century.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Forse, non so, mi viene richiesto di riepilogare brevemente i contenuti della risposta di Marc, che ha parlato appunto del ruolo che il tedesco aveva per gli ebrei all'interno degli ampi, quasi sterminati territori dell'impero Habsburgico e dopo il 1867 la doppia monarchia austro-ungarica, dove il tedesco è proprio il segmento che attraversa unendoli i vari ebraismi all'interno dell'impero, quindi lingua franca e lingua di cultura, e che attraverso tutte le differenze, no? Anche differenze ideologiche, consente la comunicazione, favorisce lo scambio, favorisce il compromesso, e quindi saranno proprio anche gli ebrei forse più di ogni altro gruppo a professare la più stretta fedeltà al modello habsburgico, questo non solo a Vienna, ma anche in tutti i vari Kronländer, in tutte le terre della corona, quindi Bucovina, Boemia, Lettonia, eccetera, eccetera. Quindi è più degli ebrei che di altri, diciamo, la scelta di un'identità tedesca, di una lingua tedesca, e anche una prerogativa sulla cultura tedesca, e una rappresentanza anche pretesa e anche a oriente dell'Austria Felix. Ecco, se ho potuto riprendere un pochino i contenuti della domanda, della risposta di Marc Volovici. So, as a third question, if you agree, I would like to focus on the role of the German within Jewish nationalism. So, at the end of the 19th century, in Western Europe, German was the most widespread vehicular language of Jewish national thought. On the other hand, in Eastern Europe, nationalist thinkers were very attached to Hebrew and to its revival as a national language, but despite all this, they continued, even in Eastern Europe, to use German in their political, philosophical, and cultural debates, and also in their writings to ensure their understanding and their dissemination to a wider audience, showing how German was felt to be a language which was suitable for transmitting modern ideas. So I quote another passage of yours in this regard. You write, similar to how Maskilim and Zionists used Yiddish extensively because of its practical and political value, while negating its very legitimacy and deriding its aesthetic value, Jewish nationalists waged a battle against the centrality of German in Jewish society, but deemed it necessary to utilize its intellectual and political prowess. So could you elaborate on this aspect, also in view of the subsequent loss of prestige of German in the sphere of Zionism, especially after the defeat of Germany in the First World War, and the creation of the British Mandate in Palestine, and the replacement of German by English and then by Hebrew?
Yes, so before the First World War, the Zionist movement was ultimately a German-speaking movement, or at least a German-centric movement in many ways. Often this is sort of explained through the fact that the first leaders of the Zionist movement were devoted German speakers and very attached to German culture, Theodor Herzl and Max Nordau. But what I show in the book is that this was not just a question of who was in the helmet movement, but it was part of a longer history of Jewish political activism that was centered around the German language and its ability to basically get things done, to make the Jewish national call audible, to make it comprehensible even beyond Jewish communities. So when the Zionist movement emerged in the late 1890s and into the next decade and a half until the First World War, German was, a constantly contested lingua franca that was essentially serving as the main language of communication. It was the language of all the key Zionist periodicals. The headquarters were located in Germany or in Austrian cities. The main debates and correspondence took place in German. And maybe most importantly and symbolically, the Zionist Congress that met every year or two was held almost exclusively in German, or at least was aimed at serving as a platform where Jews of all countries would, Zionists of different countries would meet. But obviously there was no one language in which they could communicate, and German filled this function as the main language, even though de facto it did create a lot of problems of communication, which I can expand on later. So this centrality of German was in some way a very pragmatic compromise that made sense in many ways, because as I mentioned earlier, German was indeed a respectable European language of a major European empire, and there was no reason to sort of reject this functionality of German. And even though Hebrew and Yiddish, as you mentioned, had their own prestige and value in Jewish political life, they could not fill the functions that German did. But this again created a problem of the optics, of the appearance of a Jewish national movement that proclaims some kind of Jewish national unity, and that advances an idea of a return to some kind of primordial national consciousness, and it creates a modern Jewish national culture and language, and that advances it materially and also intellectually, but ultimately that is unable to actually perform this idea of national unity. And so German came to signify the inability of Jews to actually gather as one nation around around one language that can represent themselves. And this is without even mentioning the fact that national ideas sound differently in different languages. I mean, obviously the contrast between Hebrew and German is the most emblematic one, because the national rhetoric in Hebrew, at least at that period, was still very much rooted in religious rhetoric or messianic. It did not necessarily come with the entire theological justification for returning to Zion, but this was very much present in the way Jewish national language was formulated and sounded. Whereas in German, these ideas were far more rooted in the contemporary political discourse of national self-determination and national rights and sort of ideas of liberation and emancipation that are part of the German national idiom. So this was sort of the state of affairs in the Jewish nationalism, and also specifically in Zionism before the First World War, with this tension between the functionality of German and the sort of the ideological price that comes with it. After the First World War, and most importantly after the Balfour Declaration, when the German Empire was gradually disintegrating and basically Germany lost its place as a European superpower, and Britain became the new imperial hope for Jewish nationalists in Palestine and beyond. This also affected the place of German. It was no longer possible to say that German was filling an important temporary function in Jewish political life, and that it made sense in a geopolitical set of things, because again, now it was actually English that was the new language of domination and a language of imperial politics. And even more importantly, the fact that the immigration to Palestine and the establishment of different institutions, educational institutions, and the slow but still significant rise of a monolingual Hebrew-speaking generation in this area, put more pressure on Jews in the diaspora to actually take the Hebrew cause seriously and more literally, not just as a noble dream that needs to be realized in some future generation, but as something that needs to happen now. That the fact that the Zionist Congress is still a German-speaking event is a bit of an embarrassment for Jewish nationalism. And so here too, the practicality of German and the ideological price were in constant tension, but the balance shifted basically in favor of the Hebraist pressure and against German, although it was only in the 1930s with the rise of Hitler and the Nazi regime that ultimately the Zionist Congress stopped using German as its main language, and up until 1935, protocols of the Congress were published until then only in German, but afterwards Hebrew at last became the official language that was used also in the official protocols, etc. So these tensions have a very clear transition before and after the First World War and before and after the Balfour Declaration, but in some ways also a shift in sort of the imperial center of gravity that moved from Germany to Britain and to America to some extent.
Grazie. Thank you, Mark. Allora cerco di riprendere i contenuti di questa risposta. La mia domanda mirava a disegnare un po' l'arco della diffusione della lingua tedesca all'interno del movimento sionista, del nazionalismo ebraico, e Marc Volovici ha distinto due fasi all'interno della storia del sionismo. Prima della prima guerra mondiale il sionismo, dice Marc, è un movimento prevalentemente di lingua tedesca. Herzl, Nordau scrivono, i padri quindi del movimento sionista scrivono in tedesco, e quindi il tedesco è anche una lingua dell'attivismo politico e che serve per rendere comprensibili i contenuti e l'agenda politica del sionismo. Il tedesco è una lingua franca, è il mezzo di comunicazione più diffuso all'interno delle piattaforme di discussione, dei quotidiani, degli organi di stampa sionisti, e i congressi, all'interno dei congressi del sionismo il tedesco è in una prima fase la lingua veicolare, quindi c'è questa centralità del tedesco proprio anche da intendere come con pragmatismo, insomma, per una più facile diffusione dei contenuti dell'agenda politica sionista. Questo, dice lui, anche se anche l'ebraico e lo Yiddish avevano un prestigio, avevano uno status all'interno della prima fase del sionismo, ma non potevano comunque competere con la centralità del tedesco. E dopo invece la sconfitta della Germania e dopo la dichiarazione Balfour soprattutto, e dopo la creazione del mandato britannico in Palestina, allora il tedesco perde di rango, perde di importanza, perde anche di prestigio come lingua ideologica, politica, in favore dell'inglese e dell'ebraico, soprattutto perché comincia ad affermarsi l'idea del monolinguismo ebraico, e i leader del sionismo invitano a prendere seriamente la causa dell'ebraico come lingua nazionale. Il congresso sionista smette di usare il tedesco come lingua, quindi il centro di gravità linguistico si sposta verso l'inglese e verso l'ebraico. Ecco. One last question from me, and then I would give way to would open the debate. So I would like to ask you to dwell on the role of Yiddish in this linguistic framework, in this linguistic constellation. Some have argued, you told before, that the recognition, the importance attributed to German by the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe depended in part on the spread of Yiddish among them, which was all in all linguistically close to German. Certainly within the laboratories of Zionism, Yiddish never had the same status as German and Hebrew, being instead the representative language of Jewish socialism and the Bund. But it should also be kept in mind, and you point this out in your book, that Leon Pinsker's essay, Autoemanzipation, among the first to link German to the cause of Jewish self-determination, was translated into Yiddish by Mendel and Moicher's for him. And so I would like to hear your point of view in this regard.
So the link between German and Yiddish is another, part of this sort of triangle of languages of Hebrew, German, Yiddish that arguably was the main feature of Jewish language politics in that period. So that whether German and Yiddish are close or whether they're distant, whether they have a profound linguistic affinity or they're completely set apart. This question is an open question, and both linguistically, but more importantly politically, because since basically Jews, at least some Jews, stopped speaking Yiddish, or at least adopted German as a more respectable language and as a more useful language. Many of them adopted a certain distance or some kind of even rejection of Yiddish, and sort of emphasizing how the adoption of German requires something much more significant in terms of what it represents and what it signifies. And Yiddish was the language of the Jewish past, not of the Jewish present, and certainly not of the future. But once Jewish national consciousness started to emerge in the late 19th century, and also among Jews who were not nationalists, but who just sort of strengthened their Jewish national sort of identity and consciousness, sometimes in response to anti-Semitism, they did create a more favorable and more sort of nostalgic, even let's say more complex approach to Yiddish and to the distance that it traditionally had been the main case, at least in German-speaking lands. So there are different studies that have dwelt precisely on this tension between German-speaking Jews and Yiddish, and how their language of the ancestors is also a language that they wanted to reject, but also not to deny. So Sander Gilman and Aya Eliada and Jeffrey Grossman, they all wrote on different aspects of that. And in the context of my book, I'm interested in one or two questions. First of all, how the affinity between German and Yiddish facilitated communication in real life, basically in the Jewish national movement. And here again, there was a realm where German speakers and Yiddish speakers could find some kind of common ground in order to communicate, and there were different attempts to capitalize this potential affinity, so as not to make it basically to create bridges between Jews in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but these were often clumsy or not easily well delivered attempts in the Zionist Congress and in the press to make Yiddish sort of more accessible to German speakers and to make German more accessible to Yiddish speakers, and sort of challenging different the previous ideological perceptions that emphasize the fact that Hochdeutsch and Yiddish are two very different things that are not even closely related. And the second question, which is not about the Zionist movement per se, is how Yiddishists themselves, how the main thinkers of Yiddishist movement or of national movements, non-Zionist Jewish national movements, made sense of the German origins of Yiddish. Because if you claim that Yiddish is the national language, then that it deserves to be used as a legitimate Jewish language and that can unite Jews across the diaspora, especially Ashkenazi Jews in Russia and in America and even in Palestine. If you proclaim that Yiddish is the most important language for Jewish life, then how do you explain or how do you justify the fact that it emerged, at least originally, from Germanic roots? I mean, do you deny it, or do you make it a point of pride? Because in some ways it also reflected the actual life of Jews in Europe. It was an actual product of Jewish cultural and social and economic existence on European soil, as opposed to Hebrew, which was something more textual, more ossified in some ways, a language that was not really attached or rooted in the actual living conditions of Jews, and therefore that was its main disadvantage, that it was a bit frozen in time, at least in common perception, until the late 19th century. So the Germanic roots of Yiddish were a very loaded question that both Zionists and anti-Zionists, both Yiddishists and anti-Yiddishists used and tried to sort of explore in a way that was both, exploring the linguistic question, but drawing out of it political conclusions on the legitimacy of Yiddish or the advantages and disadvantages of Yiddish for Jewish political life. So yeah, that'll be a sort of a brief overview of this complexity, and I'm happy to elaborate in the Q&A.
Thank you. Provo di nuovo a riprendere i punti che ha toccato Marc a proposito del legame tra lo Yiddish e il tedesco. Dice se siano vicini o distanti è una questione aperta, è conosciuto anche l'atteggiamento di rifiuto nei confronti dello Yiddish da parte della Scala, dell'illuminismo ebraico, del cosiddetto berlinismo, che rigetta un pochino lo Yiddish come jargon e spinge all'adozione del tedesco come lingua della rispettabilità sociale. E con l'ascesa la nascita del nazionalismo ebraico cambia l'atteggiamento verso lo Yiddish e lascia il posto così a una nostalgia per le radici anche linguistiche, e questo va forse anche di pari passo con le tendenze dei vari nazionalismi, no? Il recupero delle origini anche linguistiche è uno degli aspetti del nazionalismo europeo. Quindi quando viene rivalutato lo Yiddish come lingua nazionale, come lingua viva anche rispetto all'ebraico, che è forse più testuale, dice lui, più congelato, più sclerotizzato anche come lingua, quando viene rivalutato lo Yiddish come lingua nazionale, come lingua che unisce tutti i segmenti della dispersione ebraica, dice lui, allora però bisogna anche riflettere cioè come si spiega che lo Yiddish abbia una radice tedesca, cioè è comunque un prodotto della diaspora, quindi è un po' cigolante anche forse la ripresa dello Yiddish all'interno del movimento nazionale ebraico. Quindi le questioni sul tappeto sono tante. Thank you, Marc. Thank you very much for your clear and lucid answers. And I would now open the debate and give free way to the questions. Quindi chiunque abbia delle domande le può formulare in chat oppure anche chiedere di intervenire liberamente. Ci sono delle domande a Marc Volovici che possano integrare le 4 o 5 che ho fatto io? Roberta, il microfono.
So do you speak about the language of Goethe? And I would like to know something more about your perspective of this constellation, of this idea of the language, of the pure language of Goethe.
In some ways, often it came together with Schiller. So the language of Goethe and Schiller was the most, slogan in favor and against Germany in the Jewish context. So there was this idea that emerged in the 18th century, but that actually became a more important feature in German Jewish cultural ideology in the 19th century, that German is a language of the classics, of the Enlightenment, of great literature and poetry, and there are different ways in which German Jews justified their belonging to the German nation, especially in response to anti-Semitic attempts or nationalist attempts to question that, by saying that they have been that Jews have been basically cultivated into Germanness through German literature and language, that their embrace of the German language and of German literature has turned them into proper Germans. And this part of the story is not very surprising, because in some ways language was the one feature of national consciousness that Jews could proclaim, whereas they could not use the ethnic flag that German nationalists were more eager to wave, namely that Germans go back to the Germanic tribes that took over the Roman Empire. So this was a story that Jews were not part of, but once Jews defined their Germanness through their acquisition of the language and their attachment to it as a language of culture and as the language of their own being, then that gives them basically some kind of self-legitimacy and self-understanding as Jews and as Germans. The interesting part is that this sort of love story between Jews and Goethe and Schiller is not just the story of those who emancipated into German culture, but also of Eastern European Jews, especially, I mean, not broadly defined, but important circles of the intelligentsia in Eastern Europe and their children and their grandchildren, who also read Goethe and Schiller either in German or in Yiddish or in Russian, and who felt very attached to the emancipatory ideas of that are often, spoken, these ideas of universalism and cosmopolitanism, and of finding the spirit of humanity and of individuality in their poetry. And there are interesting excerpts that I quote in the book from Russian Jews and Jewish nationalists who actually really confess their love of Goethe and Schiller and how important they were for discovering their Jewishness, even if they were in Odessa or in somewhere in the Pale of Settlement, precisely because they were associated with some kind of universal worldview that also allows a certain realization as a nation and as a culture. And even again, Pinsker's pamphlet Auto-Emancipation, the most in some ways irredentist and Jewish nationalist text of the period, also cited metaphors directly from Wilhelm Tell, from Schiller, and spoke with some respect and reverence to the achievements of Germany and German culture and German poetry, despite the fact that the political reality was going in the other direction of a more nationalist and separating worldview. So this tension continued to be an important feature of how Jewish national idiom evolved in some degree through a dialogue, a very ambivalent dialogue with the legacies of German culture from the earlier decades.
Marc, we have two questions. I think you can read one of them in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
And the second, Mattia, vuoi il microfono?
Sì, l'ho attivato, posso?
Ah, benissimo. Allora c'è prima Mattia e poi Stefano. Prego, Mattia.
Very quickly. Yes, first of all, thank you for this fascinating presentation. This is, of course, a fundamental problem in the German Jewish culture. And I immediately thought of a famous passage from Der Rabbi von Bacharach by Heinrich Heine. Es war als murmelte der Rhein die Melodien der Agada. It is as if the river Rhine murmured, seemed to murmur the melodies of the Agada. So this interweaving from of German and Jewish languages. Yes, but my question was, could you tell us something maybe about the role of the German language in the reform movement?
Yeah. The reform movement, at least, technically speaking, it emerged in the 1820s and 1830s gradually in different parts in different Jewish communities in German principalities. But the relation of the reform movement to the story that I tell, and there are of course different facets to this history, is that one of the ways in which Reform Judaism established itself vis-a-vis the sort of more orthodox alternatives was the fact that the relation, that the language question in Jewish ritual and in Jewish prayer had to be reformed. Basically, that was one of the main innovations of the movement, that even though Hebrew is the language of the Jewish holy texts and the ultimate language of Judaism in so many ways, it is not the language that Jews actually master, at least at that period. That it's a language that they use just like Christians use Latin. It's not something that comes from their heart and from their own being. And so in this sense, the Reform movement also corresponded with the more Protestant ways of conceptualizing religious experience in general, and emphasize the need to make prayer and every form of religious congregation also socially meaningful in language itself. So they introduced a serious different Reform Jews introduced German sermons into the synagogues, which was quite revolutionary, although not all the way. But more importantly and more controversially, they also, in some ways, in Hamburg and later in Frankfurt, tried to introduce the Jewish prayer book in German and not in Hebrew. And that was a more provocative step that even within the Reform movement was not accepted by all rabbis, but or by different community members. But it did definitely take root in the ideology of Reform Judaism. And Abraham Geiger, who was maybe one of the most eloquent speakers of the Reform movement, just basically said that for him, German is a language that can communicate his Jewish religious sentiments and feelings much better than Hebrew, and this is something that Jews should not deny. And again, that was something that, at least at that time, was quite controversial and even outrageous. Even today, this sort of pluralization of Jewish linguistic experiences has become more normalized around the Jewish diaspora. And another, point that is worth emphasizing before I conclude is that this link between Reform Judaism and German became part of its legacy, even in areas where German was not, the mother tongue of anyone. So even in Reform synagogues in Congress Poland, or Reform synagogues in the United States in the 1860s and 70s, also carried out or continued this attachment to German to some degree through German immigrant community leaders or communities more large, but also more generally that German was the language of Jewish culture and of Jewish Reform culture. And it was only some kind of generational shift that happened in the early 20th century, and also the sort of monolingualization of Jewish national life later, that sort of eroded this immediate link between reformist ideas and the German language.
C'è una domanda di Stefano adesso, no? Credo.
Sì.
Stefano, la vuoi formulare a voce o riformulare a voce o la leggo?
Ma se vuoi leggerla. Mi sentite?
Sì.
Sì.
Sì, sì.
Yes, yeah, thank you very much for your speech. It was very interesting. I could not read your book, but I've caught some questions of your approach, and I have a very abstract question. So the ideological difference. I read my quest. The ideological difference of language purity was a polemical theme used by both German anti-Semites against Jewish assimilation and by Orthodox Jews against Zionists, who were accused of polluting or secularizing Hebrew as sacred language. So I'm curious to know if you have never encountered this theme, this peculiar convergence in your research about German as Hebrew language, as Jewish language.
Yeah, that's a great question, and so the theme of let's say that the linguistic layer in the polemics within Jewish society and also in the polemics against Jews by anti-Semites is really a very interesting and also loaded theme, because there is some overlap to some degree in the arguments, and the question of how to distinguish between them was difficult. I mean, even for those who made them, when they try to sort of find their own justification without sounding as if they internalized other ideas. But definitely many of the justifications of Zionism in basically defending the legitimacy of Hebrew and rejecting the legitimacy of Yiddish was based on the idea that Yiddish was not a real language, but just a distorted jargon. And again, one of the ways in which Yiddishists defended their legitimacy was by saying that this is just an anti-Semitic iteration that is basically not rooted in any linguistic perception, because every language is a mixture of languages and there's no pure language. It's an ideological fiction. So this is a debate that took place in the Jewish press and in the Conference of the Yiddishists, and I elaborate on it in one chapter in more detail. But it's a very but it's a sound observation that you make in this context. And the other side of it, which is referring to Orthodox Jews. So I mean, both Orthodox and also, let's say, non-Zionist Jews like Hermann Cohen or Franz Rosenzweig, who also were uncomfortable basically with what the Zionists or what was happening to Hebrew in Palestine, this sort of modernization, nationalization, vernacularization. This was a process that was in some ways uplifting and, bringing some kind of regenerating Hebrew culture, but basically threatening its status as a sacred language, as a language of God, as a language. I mean, how can you still treat it as a holy language while also, ordering pizza and a taxi? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And so in the 20s and 30s, there was a real debate, an intellectual debate on whether these two goals are indeed contradicting each other. Basically, can you advance Hebrew without basically ruining it in some ways? Maybe the most emblematic figure that tried to eat the cake and leave it intact was Gershom Scholem, who wrote a very moving letter to Franz Rosenzweig, where he basically warned that what was happening now to the Hebrew language is a threat to Judaism, because it's impossible to continue using Hebrew for mundane purposes without acknowledging the theological depth that within which they actually came to life. And this tension is found to be an ongoing challenge for Zionism and in its future. And he was one of the speakers of this movement, and he himself was worked and wrote in Hebrew and believed in it in so many ways. But this is a tension that was a defining tension, I would say, in Jewish nationalism. Yeah.
Thank you.
Laura? Sì.
Well, I have not one question, but three. The first one is rather general. What does the word Mitteleuropa means to you? does a Mitteleuropa in general exist? Does a Mitteleuropa exist besides or behind German? And this was the first very, very academic question. The second and the third one will be a bit less academic. The second question is, your family comes from Romania, from Ias, if I'm right. So how much did this family heritage, this ICAS, weight on your academic, on your study choices? And was the German culture cultivated in your family too when you were still in Romania or not? And the final question is, which team are you supporting tonight, England or Germany?
Okay, three important questions. As for Mitteleuropa, the easy one. Yeah, I mean, as you say, Mitteleuropa, even the very term is German, and it's not easily translatable to other languages, and it doesn't have the same longevity in other languages as in German. And in some ways, it's very much rooted in a cultural ideology that was associated also with some kind of cultural hegemony, or at least of cultural prestige, that German occupied in this area, however it's described. But beyond the Germanic resonance of this term, it's also it's also associated with a certain worldview that treated empire as a space where different and basically national communities can coexist. That it's not that basically this very idea was in some ways, at least arguably, an alternative to the nationalist drive that was taking place in different parts of the continent. So in this sense, it was not just about the German cultural sphere, but also about some kind of inclusive imperial ideology that could potentially keep these different tensions and differences of the region in one place. So yeah, so this idea appears in some ways in the book. I mean, it's not treated separately because in some ways it's omnipresent, but also it's also some kind of a forgotten tradition, a forgotten, let's say, conceptual dream of a geographical region that has some kind of a deeper cultural meaning, beyond the political context. So that would be sort of my instinctive response to this really interesting topic. Yeah, I come from Romania originally, though my family moved to Israel when I was young, and basically I was raised in a Romanian-speaking household, but German was not part of it. Quite the contrary, precisely because my father was Romanian and my mother Polish. They both remembered and also experienced the German language in its final function as the language of destruction, or the language of Nazism. So in some ways, so I didn't learn German as a kid, only in my studies, and my relation to it was to the German and also to the topic that I've researched stems from the very fact that that this sort of idea of German as a Nazi language, as a language of murderers, there was something that in Israel you're exposed to from a very early age. This is basically the first encounter with German is through its role in the Holocaust. I mean, this sort of specific words that are attached to to concentration camps and to the Holocaust and to Nazi propaganda, to anti-Semitic propaganda. And only when you start learning more about Jewish life before the Holocaust in Germany and beyond, you understand, or you start discovering the fact that not only that German had different, meanings in Jewish life before the Holocaust, but also that it had quite opposite meanings for so many Jews across the diaspora before the Holocaust, as a language of promise, as a language of change, as a language of advancement, both for liberals and for Zionists and for Orthodox. I mean, in different ways, it could bring some kind of signified hope. And so this is an element that, of course, it adds a degree of irony and tragedy to the history of German, but also that made me want to sort of study this ambivalence and this sort of coexistence of different opposing meanings to German. So this is in terms of my personal background. England, Germany, I mean, it's being recorded, so I'm not sure I want to have it, on record. I can keep it to later, but I support both, and with some ambivalence towards both.
Great, thank you.
E
Thank
c'è
you, Mark.
una domanda di Esther che se Esther vuole io leggo, altrimenti la può porre lei. La leggo.
Okay. Mi sentite? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you so much, Mark, for this very interesting talk. Congratulations, really well done. My question deals with the relationship between German and Yiddish after the Holocaust experience. So I just want to know if there are any kind of similarities or differences between both languages regarding also the previous relationship they have in the 18th and the 19th century. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I also thought about it as I addressed the post-war phase of this story. It's interesting that at least in the Jewish national debates and discussions of the 19th century, and also in the context of the Enlightenment, Yiddish was a threat, was conceived as a threat for many proponents of Jewish modernity or of Jewish nationalism because of its specific hybridity and the fact that it's not communicable, and maybe that it's too oral and not really grounded in a proper textual tradition that pure languages and pure cultures need to rely on in order to gain legitimacy as national languages. After the Holocaust, this debate basically, or this association, or this way of understanding Yiddish disappeared. So this has to do with the fact that the community of Yiddish speakers was murdered, and I mean it just added some kind of degree of obscenity to this to the impulse of attacking Yiddish and legitimacy. In some ways, Yiddish was no longer a threat to any other ideology, as Hebrew was consolidated as the language of Jewish nationalism in Palestine and then Israel. Jews in America were integrated and adopted also English, and these were the main new centers of Jewish life in the world. And Yiddish was just no longer a real threat. So in this sense, it basically there was less reason to pay attention to its features and its ideas, and more importantly, it was. And this goes back to the question that I think Matthias asked earlier, that to continue to attack Yiddish, or to basically to mock it, or to treat it as a poor, impoverished language, resonated much more painfully with anti-Semitic traditions of negating Jewish culture and Jewish life. So at least after the Holocaust, these connections were more explicit, and I would imagine more sensitive. So this is one reason, which of course is hypothetical because it's difficult to explain silences, but this is the reason, basically an inability to continue the discourse of pre-Holocaust Jewish linguistic quarrels after the destruction of European Jewry. Yeah.
Vado avanti con la lista delle domande. C'è un intervento di Elena Pierazzoli. Vuoi farlo tu, Elena? oppure lo leggo. Allora, Elena Pirazzoli writes, thank you for the amazing talk. In this period, I'm reading a lot of Martin Pollack's books, so I wonder if in the territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was some kind of linguistic and cultural competition between the two German-speaking worlds, the Jewish one and the nationalist radical German world, that world imbued with folkish ideology in which then National Socialism easily developed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting topic, and Malachia Cohen wrote about that in some articles. In some ways, and this goes back to the Mitteleuropa question. This is one story of a very prestigious European language, and in which Jews have a certain place or not. But in another way, if we look at it through your question, we have two separate histories, because the relation or the place that German occupied in the German Empire in Germany, and then in Weimar Germany, was predicated on an idea of ethnic nationalism and of some kind of unity between territory and language and culture that basically leaves little room or even no room for other languages within it. So this is why not only Yiddish, but also other minorities and other languages in Germany were considered a problem in Bismarck's Germany. So the Polish minorities and other small groups were also basically undergoing efforts of sort of Germanization or just exclusion in some ways. So this was a very monolingual framework within which German and its others evolved in the late 19th century and 20th century. But if you look at it from the Austro-Hungarian matrix, where German is just one language that doesn't try to erase other languages, doesn't try to consolidate full hegemony, then the story is more complex, because the very justification or self-justification of the Habsburg Empire and also of Austro-Hungary was precisely the fact that it doesn't try to basically to unify the territory into one culture, that it allows some kind of plurality, some kind of religious and political and cultural tolerance towards different peoples and different countries. This was its strength and arguably also its weakness in the early 20th century. And it was in the latter context of the Austro-Hungarian Empire where the relation to German was much more intimate, precisely because it didn't come at with some kind of a bargain deal where you take German, but you have to reject or at least to deny your Jewish your Jewish languages or other languages. So, for instance, Max Brod, one representative of this world, spoke very humbly and also movingly in the early 1920s that for him there was no competition between his sentiments as a Jew and his relation to Czech culture and language and his rootedness in the German language, in which he wrote. But this kind of argument was an argument that made sense in the context of Austro-Hungary, but that wouldn't really pass had he written it in Germany. He just wouldn't, this kind of multilingual ideology was rejected, or at least was less considered as legitimate even earlier. So I accept that this sort of nationalist and folkish ideology that was far more influential or meaningful in the German context, and to some degree also later in Austria, is a crucial distinction. Yeah.
And there is a note by Mattia di Taranto, who writes, I just wanted to add that it's still a controversial issue. According to some halachic authorities, for example, Chofetz Chaim in Mishnah Berurah, one cannot fulfill his obligation of reciting the Shema by saying it in any other language.
Definitely, and there's a long history of Jewish Orthodoxy and its relation to other languages, whether it's Greek or Latin or Arabic, and this question of whether a Jewish prayer in non-Hebrew counts, basically, or if reciting Jewish sources not in Hebrew is valid theologically. Yeah, I take your point, and that's a topic that I hope others will take up and give another long history of that. Yeah.
There's then a final observation by Shmuel Gertel, who writes, Moritz Güdmann in Nationaljudentums refers to German as the modern equivalent of Greek and Arabic as languages of profound significance for Jewish culture. I wonder if you have any thoughts on this idea.
Yeah, and actually this really links to the previous comment. So yeah, so it's the analogy, I think, is there. I mean, I don't have the skills and the knowledge to actually give a meaningful comparison with the case of Jews in Greek-speaking domain in antiquity, or with Arabic in the medieval and early modern period. But I do, suggest something along these lines in the epilogue of the book, because as you suggest, I mean, as Moritz Güdmann suggests, there is a long history of Jews relating to a dominant culture and an attempt to sort of define their Jewishness through these high languages. And this is where it's maybe helpful to distinguish something between different groups of languages, because of course everywhere you go and every chapter in the history of Jews in the diaspora, you will find some kind of profound attachment to the language of the land, which makes perfect sense once they adopt it and create their own culture and lives, and you can find it in English and in Italian and in French context, and of course the list is endless. But there is a specific constellation which is really, maybe I think it's correct to really put it alongside the Greek and Arabic above all other languages. Is this a very ambition to create a new model of Jewish religious identity, of Jewish religious culture, which basically transposes or transfers some of the centrality of Hebrew, or tries to even to sort of extract some of its holiness and to recreate it in this other culture using its own theological sensitivities or meanings, and sort of find through it some kind of ability to create a model of religious existence alongside other religious groups in the same realm, above all the dominant ones. So yeah, so there's definitely room and potential in a more interesting, in a more detailed comparative angle on Jewish language politics in a broader historical framework, definitely.
Laura would like to add two very short comments.
Okay. So just very briefly, I just want to add that many years ago, I wrote my dissertation paper on a then very well-known Jewish-Polish writer, Julian Strychowski. He was not only Jewish, but also gay, and he was born in Galicia in 1905. And he used to have on his desk a picture by Franz Josef. And when I asked him why, he told me, you see, this is a picture of a good man. And the second thing is more recent, as many of you know, and the Jewish Museum in Berlin, among others, there is a clip of a Berlin Israeli group, and they sing a song whose refrain is Berlin, Berlin, Reichstag shel Shalom. And well, this is maybe something that goes back to our really amazing, as Elena wrote, to our amazing chat. And I would like to go on speaking for hours, but unfortunately I think it's not possible. And so again, many thanks, Mark. It was wonderful. Many thanks to Massimiliano. And maybe we can give the word to Roberta that will draw some conclusions.
So Mark, I would like to thank you again for your participation and for your answers on behalf of all participants. Roberta. Non si sente.
Non avete sentito tutti i miei ringraziamenti. Allora, grazie a Marc, grazie a Massimiliano, a Laura, grazie a tutti voi che siete venuti, grazie infinite, è stata una bellissima occasione. Sono molto felice di concludere con questa conferenza e con questa serie di interessanti domande che hanno avuto tutte un'interessante risposta, questa serie. Vi devo dare una comunicazione fondamentale. La partita è 0-0 e quindi se volete potete vedere i tempi supplementari. Quindi abbiamo, come dire, uno scampolo di calcio tutto per noi. Grazie ancora a Marc, grazie veramente a tutti e buona estate. E a settembre ci rivediamo. Se avete progetti mandateceli, siamo molto lieti di parlare, di lavorare su questi temi e quindi aspettiamo le vostre proposte. Arrivederci, grazie a tutti.
Ciao.
Arrivederci a tutti, ciao.
Ciao, grazie. Ciao. Dankeschön.
Brava Laura.
Ciao.
Arrivederci.
Ciao.